Hello, everyone. My name is Aoife Tamura. I am a teacher trainer and academic coordinator at Atlantic School and Language Centre in Galway in the west of Ireland. And I'm here today to present this Gallery Teachers Masterclass workshop on the theme of adapting materials for use in your online or hybrid classrooms. So, what is the new normal? For me, the new normal now involves teaching in an online environment. I've been doing this for the last year in a hybrid environment, and also now, just recently, teaching again on a face to face in socially distanced classrooms. So, it's very different to how we have taught before previously. And I've had to adapt a lot. Um, Actually, I've been teaching and working in language schools for more than 20 years now. But I have to say that over the last year, I've adapted and changed my teaching style more than in the previous years. So today, I'd like to share my journey with you and some of the ways in which I've adapted my lessons to teaching in this new normal and in this new environment. So, what does it mean to adapt? And particularly, what does it mean to adapt in the language classroom? Also, we want to think about today and reflect on why. Why must we adapt? And the third thing I want to talk about is how do we do this in practical terms? Why must we adapt? Well, as Stephen Hawking said, intelligence is the ability to adapt. So, this is something that we've all had to do recently. And someone like Stephen Hawking understands that more than anyone. The idea that the intelligent thing to do is to adapt and to adapt to change. What must we adapt? Well, the first thing we must adapt is our target language. When we adapt our target language, we want to still continue to talk about current issues, things that are happening in the here and now. However, it's important to keep it light and to look for light stories, light news stories, things that are happening currently that are important and are of interest to our students. We also must adapt tasks to relate to students' lives in 2021. So, students' lives have changed considerably, and the tasks that we ask them to do should also reflect this. Another way that is nice to adapt, especially when we're working in an online or a hybrid environment, and there may be some distance between ourselves and our students, is to personalize the lesson more and to use our students' names as much as possible. And we can also do this through traditional fill in the gaps or grammar exercises that we create. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about this later in the presentation. We can also adapt functional language to real life scenarios that our students are likely to experience. And again, I'd like to discuss how this has changed and to give you some examples of what these real life scenarios might be. Why? So, again, let's look in more detail at why we must adapt. Well, in English language teaching, we've known for some time that one of the best methodologies is communicative language learning. And for quite some time in communicative language learning, we have known that adults learn best when the content is personally relevant to past experience or present concerns, and the learning process is relevant to their life experiences. So this is still true, but their life experiences and their present concerns have changed considerably in the last few years. How do we adapt? Now I'd like to show you some sample lessons from my online classes in 2020 and 2021 because as a teacher, I like to be very hands-on. And also when I'm learning and when I'm training, I like to get concrete examples. And I think for you, this is the best way to share these ideas with you, to give you concrete examples of what has actually worked in the classroom and how I have adapted my lessons for students in the online and hybrid environment. Well, we talked about adapting target language to current issues. There's a lot of sad news stories at the moment. There's a lot of quite serious news stories at the moment. And I'm sure many of your students, like my students, have maybe turned off or switched off from the news. Many of my students say that they don't read the news at all at the moment. I, however, still do. I read all the bad news stories. I read the good ones as well, too. And if I find some interesting or exciting news story that's not related to some of the more serious issues in our world at the moment, I usually make a note of this story. I download the video for the story or the image or the text, and then I use this in my class. And I suppose some of you are aware of the story here. Can you guess what it was? There was recently a story about unidentified flying objects. So a story like this can be a great source of discussion, of introducing new language, even practicing grammar with your students. And it also gives them awareness of things that are happening in the world and at the moment, current issues that they can discuss with their friends and in English. Adapting tasks to relate to students' lives in 2021 is also very important to consider because, as we all know, our students' lives have changed and the tasks that they will have to complete in English now have also changed. So, for example, they may be preparing for an online job interview rather than a face-to-face one, for example. So this is a task that we can prepare them for in English with all of the nuances and the differences in language that they will need to complete this task successfully. Another example would be they may need to have more social language, more social English. Maybe they haven't been socializing as much recently. So we can also work with this functional language and work with scenarios and role plays that will help them when they have to complete this task in reality. In terms of task-based learning and task-based teaching, David Noonan wrote a lot about this, and his ideas and his outline and guidance on this still applies. So he said that task-based language teaching, syllabus content, and instructional processes are selected with reference to the communicative tasks which learners will either actually or potentially need to engage outside the classroom. So again, we have to be very realistic about tasks that they will actually or potentially need to engage outside the classroom in 2021, 2022. So the table and the guidelines, the steps that David Noonan created for this still apply. So let's look at the traditional steps that we would use if we want to set up a task-based lesson. First of all, we must identify what the target task is. For example, given personal information in a job interview. Our rationale for this was to give the learners the opportunity to develop language skills relevant to their real world needs. We always also need to provide a model. So students listen to and extract key information, perhaps from a listening with an actual authentic job interview. And this provides them with an opportunity to hear how native speakers or users of the target language would actually do this task in reality. So they always need to have this model, and it's very important to continue to give it. Then we need to identify an enabling skill. So for this one, it could be practicing, for example, question forms. So as it says here, a drill to practice the WH questions, where, why, what, using do as well too. And so this gives the students a chance to practice the actual skills or the target language that they will need through a guided practice. Finally, we need to present the actual pedagogical task. So this could be a simulated interview, a role play, and learners will have the opportunity to use all the language skills that they use in an actual rehearsed performance of the task. Okay, so here's a sample lesson for B1 or B1 plus. And this task was to research and to identify strategies for participation in online meetings. So this is a very relevant task. I'm sure you'll agree for all of our students. It looks like online meetings are set to continue, and they're quite different to how we would have taught students in the past to interact and to use English key phrases if they're participating in a face-to-face meeting. So let's look at some details for this now. So with an online meeting, as the majority of our meetings are now, first thing I would do is to ask them some discussion questions. So find out what are their experiences of attending meetings online. Are they informal Zoom meetings with their friends? Are they other kinds of video conferencing meetings? Or are they using Teams or some other devices to meet with colleagues or coworkers? Then I would ask them to reflect on how this compares to traditional face-to-face meetings. And again, I think that a lot has happened in a very short amount of time. So it's nice to give everybody the opportunity to reflect and to discuss the differences and to compare this. Thirdly, I would get them to think about ways that they need to adjust their communication style for online meetings. So, for example, to get their host's attention, do they use some kind of visual aid or an emoji? Do they put up their hand? Do they speak to get attention? How do they know when to input in an online meeting? And I think this can still be difficult for all of us, even if we're using our own language. How do they input without interrupting or speaking over someone? I think you'll all agree this can also be difficult. And how do they make a point that will be heard and that will add value to the meeting? The next stage of the task is they must do their own research and to watch a very short video clip, just 3 or 4 minutes long, about how to speak up at Zoom meetings. Afterwards, they go back into their group and they discuss the answers to the questions again. And then immediately, they can work on strategies of how to use this advice to interact in their online classes or in their hybrid classes, even more so. These strategies are very useful. So here we have a quite simple task, but that's very useful and has been refined and targeted specifically for current needs. The other idea that I talked about was to adapt very standard grammar exercises, but to do this by using your students' own names and personalizing the lesson. And this can be done very easily and simply. Okay, so here's a sample grammar exercise that I did with a B2 C1 level class. It was an information exchange and we were practicing modal verbs of deduction. So verbs like may, might, could, should, but in the past also to speculate what could have happened, what might have happened, or what may have happened. So I simply created a couple of scenarios and asked them to get together to write a sentence about what could or might have happened in this situation. And to make it a bit more personal, I added my students' names. So you can see for number 1, Discuss what might, may, must, could have happened. You find yourself alone in a breakout room on Zoom and you can't leave. Oh, the teacher must have forgotten about me. Or, I could be in the wrong meeting, for example. You log on to the online lesson, no one else is there. What has happened? Number 3, you can add your student's name. So Mario, Janice, Antonio always logs on to the lesson at 9 a.m. It's 9:30 a.m. and she hasn't appeared. Oh, maybe she might have gone out last night. Maybe she's very tired this morning. Or she could have slept in, for example. Okay, and it continues like this. You can see some other different scenarios where they're speculating. So this was quite a fun activity, particularly if you look, say, at number 8 and 9. So, for example, Antonella is wearing a large hat. She doesn't take it off for the whole lesson. Can you tell me what might have happened? Um, Alfredo is, or not Alfredo for this one. Maria is wearing a lot of makeup, huge gold earrings, or maybe Alfredo, a diamond necklace, and a Rolex watch. What could have happened? Might he have won the lottery, for example? So the students really love to have their own names included in exercises like this. And it really doesn't take very long to prepare and lifts the grammar out of the textbook. And you can use the textbook as a basis for this and just adapt it. Also, another thing that you can adapt is functional language to real life scenarios. So, for example, many students would like to travel around Ireland for the first time. And one of the types of language that they will need for this is some functional language for staying, for example, in an Irish bed and breakfast or in a guest house. So here is an activity type for lower levels, A2, B1 class, for reviewing vocabulary for facilities in a hotel or in a guest house, and also using some modal verbs for obligation and permission. Okay, so I gave my students two different personas. Student A was the host. So he or she was running a bed and breakfast. This student, their character was that he or she liked to have visitors, but they have a lot of rules in their house. So when someone visits their house, they want them to feel comfortable, but they're very proud of their guest house. So they want them to follow the rules too. Student B is the guest. They're staying in student A's guest house. They have never stayed in a guest house before, so they're feeling a bit nervous. They have a lot of questions to ask and they want to sound polite. Because this was a lower level, what I would usually do is to put all of student A's together. So maybe if I have a group of 10, put 5 students together and get them to work on things that the host might request, rules that the host might have. So in my guest house, you must take off your shoes, or you mustn't come home after 11 p.m. Then I would put all the student Bs together, get them to brainstorm questions that they could ask about permission. Could I have some more towels? Is it okay to cook for myself? These kinds of questions to sound polite. After that, I would pair the student A's and B's together and they would role play this situation. And before this, there's a lot of pre-teaching that you can do, show them a lot of different pictures, do a lot of vocabulary, work on the language, follow the steps that we talked about earlier with setting up a task. And there's also a lot of follow-up tasks that you can do. And after I completed that lesson, lots of my students actually booked some guest houses, some bed and breakfasts online and went to stay in them. And it was actually a very useful lesson and they were able to come back and report what had happened to the class. So my question for you is could this be adapted to travel within your country, within your region, And what kind of vocabulary would you pre-teach? Also, it's very important to give the opportunity for the students to discover more about the topics in the textbook by adding a research task. And this can be particularly important if your textbook is a little out of date. Even if it's 1 or 2 years out of date, one of the ways to refresh the content of your textbook is to allow your students to research and find the up-to-date information by using a search engine like Google, for example. So this is a photo, an image from a reading. It's in an advanced textbook. And I had this lesson to teach about 6 months ago. And when I saw the reading and when I saw the photo, I was a little bit concerned because it's a photo from the 1970s. It's about a man, a French man, Philippe Petit, who did a high wire walk between the two twin towers. And it's from 1970s. So it was quite a long text. It was an advanced text associated with this. And to begin with, I was a little bit worried. I thought, is this too out of date for my students? It's 1970s. It's the Twin Towers. They don't even exist anymore. How can I update this for my class today? So what I did was I decided to first create a research plus information exchange task. And let me explain a little bit more about that. So first of all, I researched myself and I found some up-to-date clips on YouTube about this actual event. So the first clip I found, you can see here with student A, was an interview with Philippe Petit, talking about this historic Twin Towers walk. And the second video clip that I found was a trailer from a movie that had been made a few years ago about this event called The Walk. So I then created some questions, and some of the questions could only be answered by student A. Some of the questions could only be answered by student B. And some of the questions, the information was contained in both video clips. So for example, I asked, how high up was he? And both of these video clips mentioned that. Why did he do it? What was his motivation? How many times did he cross over and back? Did he think, or does he think, when he continues to do these high wire walks, about the risk involved? How does he feel before this? How did the police feel when they were trying to coax him off the wire? And what other projects is he involved in? So the students then watched it separately, and they can do this on their own devices, and then return to the class after a few minutes. And then they had to work together to discuss the answers and to try to, between them, find answers for all of these questions. And then we reviewed as a class. And after that, we were able to continue on with the reading in the textbook, and it gained a lot more significance, a lot more meaning. And they actually found the whole story very interesting and very significant. And we had a lot of things to discuss about risk and what risk means for us nowadays as well too, and what our comfort level is with risk. So it was a really very successful activity just by using this simple step of allowing the students to work with me on updating the materials in the textbook. I would also encourage you to model. So as we said earlier, with task-based learning, it's very important to have a model. So modeling means, of course, we have to model the key language, but also we can model through talking about our own experience before we ask the students to talk about their experience. Let me explain this in a bit more detail. Okay, so modeling, do model for your students. what they're expected to do or produce, especially for new skills or activities, by explaining and demonstrating the learning actions, sharing your thinking processes aloud, and showing good teacher or maybe good student work examples. So modeling not only does it promote learning and motivation, it also increases student self-confidence, and they have a stronger belief that they can accomplish the learning task if they follow the steps that were demonstrated. So I would encourage you to consider modeling with a personal anecdote. Some teachers are comfortable with this, some teachers are not, but I found it very successful and effective myself. And we have to consider that in language schools, we generally ask students to speak a lot about themselves. So we give them a lot of questions. Have you ever? Have you ever? What would you do if? Can you tell me about this? So students are constantly sharing their own experiences, but it's really nice before we ask them to do that, particularly if their level is low, to model by sharing our experiences first. So this not only gives them a model for the language, this also gives them the first steps. Somebody else has first begun to do the task for them. So here's a sample task that I created. The activity was a listening and speaking about a past holiday for quite low level. So for this, I simply used a photo. And first, I elicited some questions about the photo. And then I said, I'm going to tell you a story about a past holiday I had. So I didn't really need very many materials other than this photo that I found on Google Images, but I have similar photos of my own that reflected a past holiday I had. And I told them a story about when I lived in Japan, and I had to take a flight for my holidays to the south of Japan. And when I discovered that the plane that I was flying on was a Hello Kitty plane, which is a popular character in Japan, and how nervous I became about flying on this plane because it didn't quite look like a real plane for me. And I then continued to tell more details about what happened using a lot of past simple sentences, how I felt when I got on the plane, who the other passengers were on the plane, what happened when we hit turbulence on the plane, what I thought when I was on the plane. And I continued with this story in detail. After that, I said, now I'm going to ask you some true or false questions. And I gave them some true or false questions about what the story I had just said. Then they went into their groups and they tried to remember what I had said and if it was true or false. And then I told the story again and they checked. So this was a very easy and quick listening material for me to make, but it was very effective for them because they were really interested to hear my own personal story. And of course, then it was easy to follow up and for them to create their stories. Maybe they're a little bit lower level. So first of all, in writing, and then to tell the stories to the class and to ask the class some true or false questions about what they had said. So it opened up a lot of language, a lot of possibilities for us. I would also encourage you to think about routines when you're teaching online and particularly in a hybrid environment. So often in these environments, particularly if you have new students, they don't know what to expect. They don't know what will happen next. They're a little bit confused by the setup. So if you have regular activities and tasks that you do, it will, number one, reduce the time you need to spend setting up tasks. And number two, it will create a safe space for students where they will feel relaxed because they are familiar with these tasks. And it will also help them maybe to help each other understand what's happening next in the class as well too. So routines that I would use regularly in my online or hybrid classes are um, pronunciation gym. We would regularly do a quick 10 minutes of pronunciation, maybe once, twice, 3 times a week. When I say to my students, it's pronunciation gym time, they know that we're going to practice pronunciation, much like you would go to the gym and work out your muscles. We're going to practice working on pronunciation and moving your mouth and using your voice in a different way in English. We also, with higher levels, we would do regular quizzes like idioms quizzes. TED Talks are a regular feature, and they know the style of these talks in my class, what they'll be asked to do before they watch, while they watch, and after they watch. We regularly use pictures to create text. They're also familiar with this activity. We've been doing a lot of comedy in English, and they like this very much, particularly the higher levels. We use apps. I have about 3 or 4 apps that we would regularly use that they're comfortable with. And again, when we have a new vocabulary or particular language, they're familiar with how this will be used when they open up the apps. Group writing is also very successful because they can do it in breakout rooms together. Sometimes it's difficult to practice writing online, but if one person shares their screen and they write together, it's interactive. And it's a great way for you as a teacher to check what they've understood and to check how well they are using the language and what areas that they will need more help with. Research activities are also something that's excellent in this environment, and there's so many possibilities to use online dictionaries about the weather, up-to-date weather reports, research history stories. The possibilities are endless. And I'd like to ask if you have regular activities that you do with your classes. If you do, if you could post in the chat, that would be great. Thank you. Another very important aspect of teaching online or in hybrid classes is humor and to maintain a sense of humor. Sometimes there's a little bit more tension because of the fact that we have a distance and we're not communicating in face-to-face way, and maybe we might not laugh or engage in the same way as we would in a face-to-face environment. And humor helps with this a lot. So here's some examples of ways that you can use humor. There's so many memes available. So you can use these. They're a great source of grammar. You could see here we could use past tenses. There's even a phrasal verb. My wife, I went down, go down. Had to talk to my family. So here we have a modal verb of obligation in the past. Seem like. Again, it's also very nice language, and it's also very easy for them to understand. On the other side, this is a viral video, a video that went viral of a news report. It's an Irish news presenter who gave a very dramatic weather report that went viral. And I used this viral video clip to teach language about weather in the class. And again, we laughed a lot at it, and it was very good to create this atmosphere in the class. Ways to laugh online. So I talked about how important humor is. So let's look quickly at some ways that you can laugh online and have some lighthearted lessons with your students. The first one is breakout rooms karaoke. Most of the platforms like Zoom have a breakout room, and these are a very good space, almost like a little private karaoke booth where the students can sing a song with one other person with the lyrics. They can share the screen, and this provides great stress relief. The other way is comedy in English. I mentioned this. There's lots of really good comedy available that you can use to teach your higher level classes. Another way is lighthearted news stories that we talked about earlier as well too. Memes, as we also talked about before. And Instagram is a great source of funny images, for example, online shopping disasters. Viral videos of things like Zoom fails are something that I've also used, and there's many other funny viral videos available that are a great source of language for your classes. Here's a quote that's a nice quote that rings very true for me at the moment. So better than 1,000 days of diligent study is one day with a great teacher. If you plan your materials well and you have a really great class, I'm sure your students will agree with this. So just the last slide, just to have a look at a diagram here that I think summarizes a lot of what we talked about today: creating a positive classroom environment, providing feedback, guiding success. The teacher also is reducing the cognitive load for students, breaking down activities, checking for understanding, and reviewing learning. So these 6 elements are still a very useful guide for you to refer to. Okay, so what are your takeaways from this lesson? Could you please post on the workshop forum and also any questions that you have? And a quick summary from me would be: adapt, discover, model, routine, and humor. If you would like to learn more about this subject, there are some useful websites for ELT Resources and ways to get involved at galleryteachers.com/ELT workshops. My experience of teaching online began a year and a half ago, and it was a steep learning curve at the beginning. It was something that I'd never done before, and it took about 6 months to become comfortable with it. And for me in particular, I consider myself to be what we call a digital immigrant, in that I wasn't born into the world of technology. My first mobile phone wasn't until my mid-20s, and when I was a student myself, I didn't have one. So I'm getting more and more comfortable with technology all the time, quite enjoying using it now, teaching other teachers how to use technology. But if you had told me I'd be doing this a year and a half ago, I wouldn't have believed you. As a teacher, I had to adapt my style of teaching. I had to adapt my materials a lot. I had to adapt how I was speaking to my students. I had to adapt my methodology. There were so many things that I had to adapt in order to learn how to teach successfully online. And I'd like to share these ideas with you today.